So I just want to say thank you for everyone for coming to our, this is our third lecture of the fall so far that I've been a part of. Um, this is a show that Amanda did for us called Jump Cut at our Catonsville Gallery, and we're very excited to have her. And tonight it's going to be kind of like a Q&A setup. So I'll start off, and I've got some questions to ask. And if the audience has any questions, please feel free to type them into the chat. And then I'll go ahead and read them off. Okay. So on that note, we'll go ahead and get started. Before I do start asking any questions, can I just ask you a little bit about Jump Cut, like how you came up with the title and like what the work generally is about, to give everyone a baseline before I start Q&A?
Absolutely. Yeah. So Jump Cut, I mean, the idea for the title, I mean, it refers directly to like the editing term. But I mean, I was thinking about it in the sense of disparate things being brought together, right? And the seams being very evident. But also just, thinking of that like literally, but also sort of metaphorically. The imagery in the pieces is a departure somewhat from the work that I've done in the past that was installation driven. When I started doing installation work, it was very much about looking outward and looking at the built landscape and looking at architecture, spaces that we collectively inhabit. And this work is much more interior. It's much more about domestic space. It's much more about in my individual experience, but hopefully a broader individual experience of like sort of navigating the world as an individual, and in my case as like a parent and a woman, it's funny because these were things I started to think about prior to COVID. But they definitely have become even more urgent in my mind as a result of the last 2 years now. So that's pretty much where the work comes from in terms of the installation work. And also there's a departure too in terms of like the way I'm thinking about the pieces as being more kind of vignettes rather than like one continuous sort of cycloramic thing. There's also some works on paper, some smaller like framed works on view, and those are a recent endeavor on my part to kind of think about a lot of the concerns in my installation work, but on a smaller, more intimate scale. Because thinking about these interior spaces and domestic spaces also sort of implies a scale shift. So in a broad sense, that's where the work in this show is coming from.
To jump off of that, I'd like to ask, so where did this, I know you said you started thinking about this before COVID, but like where did the shift come from, that exterior space to looking into that more interior landscape?
A couple things. I mean, for one, I think I found in a lot of the work that I was looking at and really appreciating, broadly, I was interested myself in work that explored individual stories and experiences with a great deal of specificity. And so I started thinking more about my experience of the world and how I could begin to start to talk about that. But yeah, I had my first child in 2017, and that was around the shift. I mean, truly, like I was, it was that moment of suddenly having kids and balancing that and being in my house a lot and navigating. I mean, I'm by far from the only person to have had that experience. It's not remotely unique, but it was my first entry into that. And yeah, I started thinking differently about the kinds of stories I wanted to tell. I also, in some sense, wanted to expand my visual vocabulary beyond what it had developed over the course of the past decade. Like as I mentioned, prior work was really a lot about the built environment, a lot about architecture and that sort of thing. And while all of that stuff still interests me, it was almost like not a big enough container for all of the things I want to talk about and things I want to draw and things I want to see in front of me. So this pivot allows me to think about, you know, the realm of memory and literal interior space, what I'm thinking about and what, what happens in that kind of space as well. So in a certain sense, it just expanded what I could be playing with in the sense of images.
Well, thank you. And as you said, it's not your own experience. You're not the only one who's had that experience. But
Right.
I do think the interesting thing, though, is that how each individual artist approaches that experience, coming from that one point of view or perspective. And I absolutely love how, like, when you're thinking of these interior thoughts, and if you think about it being so close, but your work is so large. And so, like, even though they're vignettes, it's still like, it makes you really look at space and really think about it. So that's cool, taking it to that kind of scale. So that's really fun. And then, of course, the smaller pieces, seeing the kind of the contrast between the two sizes is very interesting, at least to me. So that's so awesome. Sorry, I'm going off. But I do have my list of questions here, and some of the ones that our students always like to hear is one. This is the very first one: is what made you want to be an artist?
I mean, I don't. Well, I'll tell you that it was never like. It wasn't like I didn't decide to be an artist in the sense of like maybe this could be my career until I was maybe like midway through undergraduate, my undergraduate degree, at the earliest, because I didn't know artists growing up. I think that there were artists that I could have known, but they weren't in my sphere. I other than my friends who also made art. I didn't know working artists. I grew up in Toledo, Ohio. It was a great place to grow up. Great museum, lots of wonderful things about that part of the country. But yeah, it just wasn't part of my sphere of understanding. Artists were dead people, like artists were not like actual people. And so but I always knew I liked drawing and I liked to make things. So I kind of had this I never questioned that I wanted to do something with that. And it was never a question that I wanted to make my own things and to whatever end that would take me. But when I went to school, it was initially with the thought of like becoming a graphic designer or something. The only models I had that seemed viable were ones where I could become like a commercial artist or maybe an illustrator, or, these were all of which are great paths, but it turned out it really wasn't for me. I did a couple of internships, which I definitely recommend anyone. That's a great and valuable thing to do. Because in my case, I discovered that, even in a couple of really great internship programs for graphic design, that it was just like, I really didn't like it. I didn't like that experience. It didn't allow me to pursue what I loved the most about making things. And yeah, when I went to college, I started to actually meet, like through initially my professors, but then sort of spurring off of that, more and more people who actually did make a living as artists, who were living artists who showed their work in museums and galleries. And the more I understood about that world, the more it seemed like it was something that was not only accessible to me, but something that I wanted to pursue. So.
So leading into that a little bit, talking about like, it didn't really leave you room to create what you wanted to create. Like, at what point did you realize that you wanted to move beyond those boundaries, just aside from not liking, I guess, the structure of the way graphic design worked or the internships?
Structure was a big one. I am not I'm very detail oriented about the things I want to be detail oriented about, the things that I sort of prioritize, which is probably true of just about any artist that you could talk to. But I had a really hard time, like the way I work. And I think this is probably evident from seeing the work in the show. Like I come into a space and there's a certain amount of extemporaneous action that has to happen for me. Like even with the best laid plans, and I've tried this, especially early on when I was making installations, I would think, okay, like I'm gonna plan it all out, like absolutely 100%. Like this is what I'm going to do. Here's what it's going to look like. This is here, I made all the pieces in advance, everything I know. And it just doesn't work that way for me. I lose interest for one, but also I would get to putting something up in the space and I just, have new ideas, and you want to pursue those ideas as you see them, they start to occur to you. It's like, even though it's a different process in some ways, making an installation piece in the way that I do on the wall is like painting. Truly, in my mind, you're responding as you go, and you have that ability. I have that ability to take things down, put them back up, move them around, draw something new, whatever. And so it's just like working on an easel with a canvas. If you can paint something out or scrape it off or put it back on or whatever, you can follow those flights of fancy or those ideas that only occur to you in the moment of making. And that's what I love. That's what I found that I was very excited about, were those like moments where, I'd have some weird idea that only occurred in those moments. And I also really just like how the constraint of time makes me act. So being in the space and saying, okay, I have this amount of time, a week, or I have 4 days, and I have these materials and have this space. And you can't hum and haw, you have to make decisions. And that process of making those decisions within that time constraint, like for me, yields results that I'm excited and interested about. So there's not a lot of place for that kind of freewheeling ethos in let's say graphic design, just because you're working with a client, and you are working with deadlines and there's usability, there's having to make something that can work for a particular purpose. Mm-hmm. So I mean, it's just what I found is that it's a really different discipline. It's funny because it's like you sort of go into it maybe as a young student thinking like, oh, these are similar because they're visual. Mm-hmm. And they are, but then that's where the similarities, they really are very different ways of working.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So that actually did answer one of my questions I had.
Sorry.
No, it's perfect. It was perfect. It was just, do you plan before starting creating installations or being spontaneous? So
I could say a little more about that actually. I do to a certain extent. Mm-hmm. I will think of, there's like there's an idea, like in this case, the thinking about the domestic space and that the experience of living in your house for a year and not leaving. So there's some initial ideas that that are there. And everything springs from those. And so I always think of these are a set of images that I want to work in, I think of, a general color scheme, a general approach, so like the idea of I'm going to do this as vignettes, or I'm going to do this as a full sort of floor to ceiling thing, or, whatever. So some general kinds of signposts I try to put in place and work within that, because it does help to have constraints, in my experience, but you have to be really strategic about what the constraints are.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Let's see. So that goes along with, what is the absolute hardest part about creating your work, and what part do you find the most fun?
The hardest part. That's a really good question. Increasingly, it's physically difficult.
Mm.
Um, it is sometimes because it's a lot of, at least with installation, it's a lot of climbing up ladders, and climbing down ladders, and up and down 8,000 times. Holding your arms. Like, I've been doing this for about 15 years now, and I'm not that old, but like I've gone from being a pretty young person to being a more of a middle-aged person in that period of time. And it is a lot harder. Like my knees and back start to ache after spending like days in a row on my hands and knees making drawings on the ground. And that's a real thing you have to kind of combat, because it's like, sometimes it's tempting to not take a certain kind of a risk with the scale or how you do something, because it's going to be a literal pain in the ass. So that, the most fun, another thing I would say is just, I am not a fan of some of the important stuff that it is. I like to get right into the drawing. Like, there are important things to do before you start that make the process easier. And whether that's building an armature or, prepping materials, it's like analogous to if a painter were gessoing canvases or something. I get real excited about the middle part where I'm actually making the thing. So it's always a challenge to like do the important groundwork that's necessary to get to that point. Mm-hmm. The most fun part is the actually being in the space, though, and the actually like putting things on the wall and just having that experience of it really, like, it gets to be like a flow, where you're just the outside world kind of shuts off and you're there and you're making moves. And I love the drawing. I love drawing in all of its forms, whether it's using a big brush and larger than me, or a tiny little crocodile pen and making tiny little marks. Those things are really connected in my mind, and I love it all. So that's my favorite part.
Thank you. So this kind of goes back to, okay. So how often are you basing your structural elements from your imagination versus real buildings that you see, around town in Baltimore?
It's a bit of both. When I do, when I'm planning an installation, and whether it's like the one that I did, for CCBC, that has a lot more sort of objects and material aspects of material culture, right? Or like architecture. I like to photograph things, sketch them from life, do a lot of initial work, like sort of familiarizing myself with the actual look of whatever it is that I'm going to be drawing. So, I have in the past, and I actually have a body of work prior to even starting the installation work that was all sort of plein air drawings of streetscapes and cityscapes. And I did that for like 2 or 3 years exclusively, just looking at things and drawing them. And it's something that I still do, and I don't always show that work, but it's something that I find to be very important in terms of noticing. Because what I like to do is get really, really familiar with something and then spit it out from my imagination. Think about, because there's a certain energy that comes from drawing something from your imagination. There's a certain energy, an interesting way that you emphasize aspects of things in relationship to their importance, in relationship to how they have stuck in your brain, that contingency and that sense of subjectivity is really exciting for me. But I think for me to get there, I have to spend a lot of time just really looking at the thing firsthand. So when I'm actually making the pieces that go into like the installation or into the collage on a smaller scale, so occasionally I will look at something as a reference, but I try as much as possible to not really look at photographs or the object or that comes before.
Cool. So how your mind takes things in, and then, as you said, you find like the focal points, and okay, cool, awesome.
Yeah, focal points, but also just like this kind of emotional energy or the psychological charge of the thing. It's like if you ask somebody to like draw a shark from a photograph versus asking them to just draw a shark, like one is going to be very, very potentially very accurate. Mm-hmm. From a visual point of view, but then the other is maybe going to be more accurate from the point of view of like the terror or the violence or, these other attributes. So I like that side of things. I like it to have like a sense of verisimilitude, but also like visual verisimilitude, but I also like the gestural quality of line and the way that we exaggerate things because we care about them or we're afraid of them or we perseverate on them or whatever.
Cool. Thank you. Let's see. So here's one. What's the largest installation you've ever done?
The largest installation I have ever done was a piece called RFP that I did in Baltimore in 2015. And that was at a space that is sadly no more, EMP Collective. But EMP was in a huge, like, I think it was a former department store in a building on Baltimore Street, downtown Baltimore, sort of west side near Lexington Market. And yeah, that was 2,500 square feet. And I covered like every surface that I could. On the walls, there were things hanging from the ceiling that came out into the space. There were like movable pieces that floated around the space. And that was a month. I was in there for a month, just drawing and drawing and drawing some more. And so definitely an endurance project.
Let's see. Oh, okay. So my last question before I can start taking some from the audience is do you keep the art from the installations, or do you recycle elements into other places, or is it completely new every time?
Some of all of the above. I do keep almost everything, at least for a time, for a couple of reasons. One, first of all, I don't want to be wasteful. It's a lot of paper that I use. I don't like the idea of just using that stuff and then it's gone. But more pertinently, like from a conceptual point of view, especially the way these things started as explorations of the built environment, but even still, as beginning to think about, the mental space or memory or whatever. I liked the concept of reusing pieces because of that idea of like almost adaptive reuse, right? That something that I used one way, one time would take on a new identity in another installation. I felt like it was kind of helpfully, referred back to that kind of fluidity in the environment. And I also really just enjoy, I'm not precious about it when I deinstall things. I just kind of rip them down and not looking to preserve it for future exhibition, at least in the form that it was in. But then when that happens, you get these kind of bizarre artifacts. Like I'd get a piece of something stuck to another piece of something with a little bit of something else in between. And I roll that stuff up and keep it in my studio or my basement or whatever. And then a couple of months later, I unroll it and I'm seeing new things. It's making, my context has shifted. The things I care about have shifted. The intent I'm bringing to whatever it is I'm working now is something different. And as a result, when I look at these same pieces, I see a different kind of potential. And that's super exciting for me. Eventually, things just fall apart, right? You can't use them anymore, because I also don't use very like archival or fancy materials. I use like a lot of craft paper. I use the literal packaging that like my art supplies come in. Because if you've ever like ordered, pencils or something from Blick, or Amazon, it comes in a huge box and there's like a bunch of stuff around it. Just anything, big box. So, I've done that where I just literally use like the refuse that accumulates from ordering things. But I buy things that are just, inexpensive and plentiful.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So in a way, then when you do reuse them, they get reworked. Like, do you then redraw on them? Or
sometimes?
Okay.
Yeah, sometimes it's about placement, the context changes it. Sometimes it's literally redrawing on it. Something that may have started out as, one like a stoop or a TV antenna or chain link fence or something. Maybe I'll turn it into a texture that lives in a field of grass, or maybe I cut out a word bubble shape out of it and it becomes that, or, so it's like, I sort of start to look at it as, for its, formal qualities aside from whatever the image was. And usually I'm using things in a fragmentary way in relationship to what they started out as. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you. So I'm just going to go ahead and open up to questions from the audience. If anyone has anything, please feel free to type it into the chat and I'll go ahead and read it off. Okay, we have one here from Emily. So do you think your time being a graphic designer influenced how often you use typography in your work, or were you always drawn to having words in your pieces?
That's a good question. I maybe a little bit of that. I think it's a bigger part of it is my interest in comics, and graphic novels and that form. The way I draw is absolutely influenced by that as well. I'm definitely that's some of my favorite art. And so like I have a definite like narrative sort of storytelling impulse in the work that I make. And words for me are just a way of evoking other sensory experience. Oftentimes I'm putting in not words so much as like syllables or, what might translate to like sort of a just like a sound in the environment, da, 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 or, sort of onomatopoeia, right? Because I want someone to read it and think of a sound or sort of ambient sound or whatever. So that's part of it. I love how text looks. I don't, maybe it's from being a graphic designer or thinking I would be a graphic designer at one point. I don't know, but it's something I'm incredibly, I just love looking at. I love looking at text. I love looking at signs. I love the collision between what something says and how the way it looks can either correspond with what it says or more interestingly, like conflict with or grade against it. Movable type signs are a great example of this. They're always like super dispassionate looking in terms of like the sort of what they seem to suggest, right? Like, cause it's all the letters are the same. And sometimes there's like weird spacing and sometimes they take a W and turn it around and make it an M. And like, it always like the tone reads as like monotone, dispassionate kind of whatever, but it's always trying to like alert the passerby to something exciting, and so that like weirdness, like that just really appeals to me. I think it's funny. So things like that. I just think there's something kind of cool and interesting and poetic about the way text has a visual life.
Mhm. Do we have any other questions?
Everyone, this is like my class actually. It's the end of the semester and it's like, hey guys, how's everyone doing? And it's like, I get it. I get it.
Yeah, and it's, the holidays are coming up, and I'm sure everyone's really. Oh, Jack. Oh, Jack Livingston. Hi, Jack. Jack would like to know if you could talk about the role of being in this region.
Yeah, so I'm not from here. As I said, I'm from Ohio. I moved here in 2007, so I've been here for some time. And it's been like one of the best things. I mean, it wasn't, I guess it was a decision I made. It was not like a real super intentional decision in that I came here for a job that I got. So I didn't know where I would end up, and I landed here, and it's one of the most fortuitous things that ever happened to me, because this area is so inspiring, and it's so full of artists, and um, it was unfamiliar enough for me. Coming from where I came from, it's very different in some ways from Toledo, from the Midwest, because the Midwest is newer and it sprawls, and there's room to sprawl, and there are cornfields at the edge of the cities, and it's very flat. And so there's a different feel in a lot of ways. But there's a similar feel in a lot of ways. Rust Belt cities have that decay, but it's simultaneously that sort of double-edged sword of reuse that goes in the direction of like gentrification, but also like sort of more positive reuse that, might be more beneficial to a broader, subset of the community at large. Right. They're both Baltimore and the Midwest are places that are subject to a lot of turnover and change. I don't know. So I saw things they're familiar to me. That made me feel at home here, but then enough about it felt really, really different that it was exciting and sort of like, ooh, like this is a new place. I want to find out about it. And it's also just visually very exciting, because Baltimore is an older city comparative to the rest of the United States, not so much the rest of the world. There's an incredible diversity of architecture. There's, a lot of that in close proximity, right? So there's that chock-a-block feel of looking at like a city block and seeing, decades sort of writ large upon it. And seeing, how people have interacted with it and how just the passage of time has interacted with it. It's very legible. And it's legible everywhere. But again, it's, East Coast city that's older, that's smaller, that everything's closer together. And so, and it has this very, I think, unique history in a lot of ways that it just was compelling. It was compelling in a way that made me want to do nothing but look at it and make work about it from the point that I moved here. And the initial standpoint was to just get to know it. Like I moved here not knowing anyone here. And so it was kind of lonely and kind of like a little driftless. So a lot of this going out and making drawings was like a way to get to know where I was, but also like a way to like fill my time. It was like I didn't quite know what to do with myself, so I spent most of my time doing that. And it's just such a rich subject as a place. And as I was here longer and I got to know it more, of course, there's so much. We really are so spoiled here, because the creative community is vast and brilliant. The people who make work here are, I put them against anyone anywhere in the world. I think that we have a really top notch artistic community, and it spurred this entire way of working that I've developed. I don't think that the way that I work would have happened without me living here. I don't know if that answers the question, but
I think it does. So I think at this point we're good to go ahead and sign off, unless anyone has any more questions. Just gonna wait 1 second. Yes, there's one more question. Are the scenes you make inspired by certain memories or more imagination?
Yeah, sometimes a little, I think a little bit of both. Uh, the scenes I make are not like linear narratives, right? I'm thinking more about, like, especially the scenes in the show. I mean, I'm the installation pieces. I'm almost thinking about what the inside of my head feels like at different points, and it's sort of describing a psychological state or something. So memory comes into that. Imagination is also comes into that. It's some of both. With my smaller pieces, I found that it's more about me imagining a character that's certainly shaped by my experiences, and thinking about, that's more of a jumping board though. Usually I've found that when the smaller works on paper I make, they have a protagonist in them somewhere. That becomes a way for me to sort of explore figure more. And those figures are sort of have a relationship to me, but they aren't me. I sort of I've started to think of those as beginning to describe moments in somebody else's experience. So it's some of both. I don't know. I mean, I wouldn't say there's any one formula. It's all pretty important.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And I'm going to go ahead and say we'll end the talk.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me. Thanks for having me for the show. It was such a wonderful experience.
Oh,
see you again.
Good seeing you. Yes. Thank you so much, because when I was looking at the schedule and I looked at the gallery and I was like, I've been wanting to have you back for a while, and like, this is perfect. I hope she's available. So I'm glad you're willing to do it. And thank you again. And the show's still up for a few more days.
Yeah.
If anyone wants to stop by and see it. And if you can't make it in person, we are having it up on the website as a virtual tour. So you can always also do that. So on that note, I will bid everyone a good evening, and thank you again for coming.
Nicole, thank you so much. And have a wonderful evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming.